God bless. I want to show you today another powerful example which totally takes down a false doctrine by some Hebrew Israelites that only Israelites can be saved. Now, Acts chapter 14 is a very powerful example. If you read it in its full context, it really takes down this false doctrine espoused by some of these professing Hebrew Israelites. Acts chapter 14 is in the time period of Paul's first missionary journey when he's going out to preach, and he's going to places like Iconium and Lystra. But notice what he says, right, in verse 7, right? This is the fundamental point and why I continue to make videos about this particular set of Hebrew Israelites, because it's about the gospel, right? Paul here, it says in verse 7, it says, and there they preach the gospel. The fact of the matter is there are many things that Christians and Hebrew Israelites will disagree on, right? We can think about the deity of Christ and other things. But for me, I always spend my time in these videos dealing with this group, dealing with the gospel, because the gospel is the heart of the matter. What I've seen from my experience and my engagement with them is many of them will turn this into a race war. They'll turn it into black v white. This is why I've been looking forward to making the video for quite some time, because it highlights just the key issue going back to the Old Testament. So what we see here is, starting at Acts chapter 14, verse 13, we see that the priest of Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and garlands unto the gates and would have done sacrifice with the people. As Paul and Barnabas do a miraculous work, they heal somebody who's sick. They now start proclaiming that these people are gods that have ultimately come down in flesh. And they're basically trying to do idol worship. They're basically trying to sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. Now what we see next in verse 14, it says, when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard, they ripped their clothes and ran in among the people crying out. And I want to highlight the fact that the passage says here that they're apostles, right? And the reason I'm highlighting that is because one of the arguments you hear from time to time is you'll hear, and this is what they're forced to do in many different ways, Hebrew Israelites that hold to this false doctrine that only Israelites can be saved will have to start discrediting the Bible. Right, they'll start cutting away certain scriptures and saying, you know, no, this isn't irrelevant, this isn't relevant, etc. And I'm highlighting this here that so you can see that the Bible is here saying that these were apostles. Now, as the apostles here are stopping this, notice what they said and saying, sirs, why do ye these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that ye should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein. Notice first and foremost that Paul and Barnabas are saying to these individuals, we're men of like passions with you, we're just like you, right? And the reason I'm highlighting this is because you have certain Hebrew Israelites in these camps who will go on like white people are the devil, etc. They'll call white people Esau and all this different kind of stuff. But Paul is here speaking to these Gentiles and highlighting that we're just like you. And this is what we always need to remember as Christians, going back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, that all mankind is created in the image of God, right? Not just darker skinned people. We are all made in the image of God. But notice what Paul says next, which is powerful, right? He says, and we preach unto you that you should turn from these vanities unto the living God. Now, this is important because not only is Paul saying to these Gentiles, right, that they're made in the image of God, just like Paul and Barnabas were made in the image of God. He's highlighting again, just as I highlighted from verse 7, that he's preaching. They've come to preach to them to do what? To turn from these silly idols, silly idol worship, and turn to the living God. Now, again, the reason this is significant is because one argument these Hebrew Israelites will make is they'll say, no. This is not speaking about true Gentiles as we mention it, right? When I mention a Gentile, right? When I say Gentile, I'm speaking about a non-Israelite. They'll either say that this is speaking about a Greek-speaking Israelite, right? That's what it's referring to as a Gentile. Or you hear them say things like, this is somebody who is an Israelite, but doesn't know they're an Israelite, right? And the reason they'll have to go down these routes is because they don't believe anybody other than an Israelite can be saved. And this is again why a passage like this is so powerful. Because like I said, if you read through the passage in Acts chapter 14 in context, it's clearly differentiating and talking about true Gentiles as we may understand them today as Christians, non-Israelites, right? Not Israelites in a Gentile state of mind or anything like that, right? And we know this quite clearly as well when we look at this passage in more detail. But I'm saying this now, as we continue through this passage, it makes even more sense, right? So he says, turn from idol worship, turn to the living God. And notice what he says next. He says, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. This is the kind of verse which really takes down this false notion that, you know what, oh, these are Israelites in a Gentile state of mind, or these are Greek-speaking Israelites. The time period Paul is including here would go beyond, right, would go past the time when the Israelites were scattered abroad to be in some sort of Gentile state of mind, not knowing they're Israelites. And Paul is highlighting that previously, the Lord allowed these different nations, right, non-Israelites, to walk in their own ways. He didn't give them, like he gave the Israelites, the 10 Commandments, the law of Moses, etc., the covenant. And the reason this is significant is because what Paul says next drives home the point that it was always God's idea, it was always God's plan to graft in Gentiles, true Gentiles, into the faith. This is why it should never be a surprise in the Old Testament when we see people who are truly Gentiles, not Israelites, not scattered Israelites, not Israelites in a Gentile state of mind, coming to join the nation of Israel. So he's set up to say that, look, turn from vanity, turn to the true God. Before, in times past, the Lord allowed these different nations to walk in their own way. But notice what he said. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. So notice what he's saying there. The same thing you see if you genuinely read through the Old Testament, right, without this only Israelites can be saved false doctrine, you can see quite clearly that there's example after example after example in the Old Testament, non-Israelites coming to the faith, attaching themselves to the nation of Israel and being grafted in, right, is the language he used today. But notice, right, he said, previously, God allowed these different nations to walk in their own ways. But he doesn't say this was because, or this is to blind them because they were isolated and never had an opportunity to be saved. He says, nevertheless, right? Even though God allowed these nations to do their own thing, he left them not without witness. Why would Paul be saying here that God didn't leave these other nations, which were not Israelites, without witness? Because just like Paul is here preaching to them at that particular point in Acts chapter 14, turn from these vanities, turn to the true God. Previously in the Old Testament period time as well, God was still witnessing to them without necessarily giving them the covenants that he gave to Israel. The fact that God is blessing us with food and fruitful seasons and gladness and all these different kind of things is enough for even somebody who doesn't have a covenant, right, like the Israelites did, or hasn't come to join themselves to the Israelites. It's enough for them to come to serve the true God. So where some Hebrew Israelites, when we get carried away with verse 16 and think, you know, see, that proves that God wasn't dealing with them. Paul shuts that down in the very next verse by saying, nevertheless, even though the covenants weren't for the Gentiles on a broad level in the Old Testament, God was still dealing with them, which is why we see multiple examples in the Old Testament of Gentiles coming and attaching to the Israelites and becoming children of God. He continues here into verse 18, and it says, and with these sayings, he scarce restrained the people, that they had not done sacrifice unto them. So by him saying all of this stuff, it was enough for them to realize, well, okay, you know what? We don't need to worship these individuals. They're men just like us. They're made in God's image just like us. And now they're preaching the gospel to us and showcasing to us that this is what God has been doing all the way from the beginning. He's been giving witness, and now we've got even more witness, even less excuse to not trust in the one true God. So the next time you engage or you see a Hebrew Israelite like this particular group I'm talking about, coming for Gentiles and saying that only Israelites can be saved, here's another example just to showcase to you that this is a false doctrine from the pit of hell and it needs to be stopped. God bless, and make sure you like this video and share this with someone that you know it can bless. God bless, I'll see you soon.